Hello and welcome to the Resistance GB podcast. My name's Will Coleshill, at Will Coleshill on X. And today I'm joined by Robin Tilbrook, chairman of the English Democrats, freedom fighter, solicitor and founder of the Workers of England Union. Robin, where will people know you from?
Well, Will, thank you for having me on, first of all. Where will they know me from? Well, as you rightly say, I'm the chairman of the English Democrats and also of the Workers of England Union. I have brought one or two interesting cases over the years as a solicitor, one of which was challenging Theresa May's extension of the notice period for Brexit. And also we challenged the lockdown regulations as well. I've certainly been involved in some of the sort of key struggles of our time, and I'm currently looking at trying to force the government to have a national statutory inquiry into the child rape gangs.
Wonderful. So how did you get into politics and how do you get involved with the English Democrats and come to be one of the biggest proponents of English nationalism in the country?
Thank you. Well, I saw what was happening at the time Tony Blair got elected, because I'm a lot older and longer in the tooth than you are. But at the time, what was happening was that it was clear that Scotland and Wales were going to get their own parliaments and first ministers and governments. But there was no talk about anything happening for England. And I thought, my first thought was it was strange that the Conservatives weren't trying to push that. So I started sort of pushing to see what they were going to do, to which the answer was nothing. In fact, Norman Tebbit went so far as to say that even raising the issue of England should be discouraged because he was saying it's a challenge to the United Kingdom.
But it wasn't a challenge to have all the regional assemblies for Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland.
So the EU at the time was pushing for there to be regional assemblies, but it was decided by the British government, both Labour and Conservative, that they were going to have national regional governments for Scotland, Wales, and curiously Northern Ireland, because obviously Northern Ireland isn't really, in a normal sense, a nation. But not for England. In fact, Charlie Kennedy, who was then the leader of the Liberal Democrats, he said he supported regionalising England, in other words, breaking England up into regions. And he said he supported it because it was calling into question the idea of England itself.
So what was the agenda behind that? Why did they want to attack England?
They wanted to get rid of the idea of England, and they wanted to get rid of the idea of the English nation, and to regionalise that so that it was broken up and unable to unite or coalesce around any particular interests. I think it was ideological. It was something that some left-wing thinkers have been wanting to do for a long time. I mean, Karl Marx, after the Year of Revolutions in 1848, is said to have complained that all the revolutions of Europe, he said, are wrecked on the rocks of England. So it's been a long-standing dislike of the idea of England, and of course George Orwell commented that English academics hated the very idea of England, so it's a long-standing thing that people haven't liked the idea of England. I don't know exactly what the origin of that is, but if you applied that to almost any other nation, you'd be accused of being racist, wouldn't you?
Or democidal.
Possibly, yes.
But it seems okay if it's us.
Yep, I agree. It does. That's the way it is. Professor Eric Kaufmann, who was at Birkbeck University and is now at Buckingham University, he says that what we've got in this country is asymmetric multiculturalism, whereby various other communities, they are welcome to have community expression, and they've got to be looked after. But if you're saying you're English, then that means that you have to give way to everything that anybody else wants.
Well, you see a lot of that with, Emily Thornberry's famous tweets of
You do.
the white van and the flag.
Yes.
What did you think of that?
Well, I thought it was. I wasn't surprised. I was pleased to see it in a way, because what it did was it exposed something that I knew was their attitude, it was straightforward racist discrimination in effect, and that is their attitude, I mean we saw a similar glimpse in a way on Question Time a couple of weeks ago, where Lucy Powell, who's the leader of the House of Commons in the Labour government, she had Tim Montgomery, who's was a very wet Conservative. He's now gone over to Reform, but he's certainly not somebody who expresses himself in any sort of very forceful manner about things, and he was just starting to raise an issue that's people have become increasingly aware of, which is the massive extent of the Pakistani Muslim child gangs that have operated in, now turns out, over 50 towns and cities in England, and involve several 100,000 girls. So he was just raising it and sort of pointing out that Channel 4 had done a documentary about this. Unlike Adolescence, which is not a documentary but pure fiction. In which the perpetrator is a white boy, with that, Labour were trying to push that as being something that every school should have to watch. I mean, I don't know if you watched it, but it's certainly not something that's going to keep any school kids watching for very long, because it's pretty tedious. But the one thing it did have going for it was that it did make clear that in the view of the filmmakers, none of the figures of authority, whether it be police or teachers or social workers, actually knew what the hell they were doing. They were all in a complete muddle, and they were completely confused about what their role should be. Had no sort of moral element to it, which obviously is actually quite true of the country we now live in. Anyway, so Tim Montgomery was raising this issue about the child rape gangs, and Lucy Powell was sort of heckling him, which you're obviously not supposed to do as a fellow panellist on Question Time, but she was heckling him and trying to interrupt, and saying that what he was saying was a dog whistle, and also that he was blowing a little trumpet, she actually had to be told to keep quiet by the chair of the Question Time, but I think that again exposed the attitude that that they're just not interested in white working class English people and what happens to them. And of course, one of the leading commentators on the left, but traditional left, is Paul Embry.
He was,
and
a
he's been saying that
unionist,
he was,
wasn't he?
and well, I think I'm not sure whether he's resigned from the Fire Brigade Union after the way they treated him. It would certainly be understandable if he did, but he's been commenting for some time that Labour doesn't seem to care at all about about any traditional values, and certainly not about the white working class English. I think that going back to the Emily Thornberry tweet, that was simply an expression of that attitude of sheer contempt for white working class attitudes.
What do you think it is about England that makes us so subject to attack? Is it that we've got, this tradition of liberalism? Is it that we were the world superpower, so our culture is spread around the world? Is it because we've got capitalism at our heart, as the first industrialised nation?
Well, it is an attack on industrialisation, capitalism, the current order in the world, and what's happened over the last century or so. But I think that is a product of the sort of second wave of communist agitation. What happened in the Cold War was that eventually the communist regimes collapsed because their economic systems didn't work. But since then, there was a period of time when liberals in particular got completely complacent about things. They didn't recognise that just because the communist regimes had collapsed, that there was going to be a sort of next wave of communist agitation, which was focused on cultural issues, the nation state and the national group that are most associated with the rise of capitalism, the first industrial revolution, colonialism, and all the various things that are being attacked, is actually the English, because we did have the first industrial revolution, and much of the modern form of, or recent times form of capitalism was evolved in England, so it's not entirely surprising that we've wound up being attacked, but it is a generalised attack, and it doesn't stop with us, of course, because it's also looking at undermining white power, undermining the patriarchy, and various other aspects of American society as well.
Well, they've tried to destroy Kipling, haven't they?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captors' need. And then the bit that I really liked about it was the paths ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread, go build them with your living and mark them with your dead. The idea that we had some sort of noblesse oblige to go round and civilise the world and make it a greater place.
Mm.
And they take that and they turn that into essentially, they believe that there's some form of racism or bigotry rather than just calling ourselves what anyone would have called us turning up. They go, oh, white man. It's amazing.
Yeah. And of course, that's part of the reason why Churchill's now racist, because he, after all, was, throughout his life, a keen advocate for the British Empire. It is worth saying, of course, that the British Empire was certainly in the 19th century was a liberal empire. It wasn't it didn't operate like, for instance, the Belgian Empire, which is in many ways the worst example.
Horrific. Was that King Leopold?
Yeah, and where he took over the Congo, and there were widespread massacres, and he basically enslaved the entire population to extract gold and diamonds and other things that would make him rich.
Well, the funny thing is, I recently found out that after we left India, they abolished juries. So everyone's talked about independence and they talk about democracy and they talk about these countries being free. But you, as a solicitor, I'm sure understand that the guarantee of your freedom is being judged by a jury of your peers.
Yes.
And
that's under attack at the moment.
They've lost that. The whole subcontinent.
But it's also under attack here.
Yeah.
When Labour wants to get rid of jury trial where possible. And they have the system has already got rid of jury trial out of almost all civil matters. At one point, we were left with defamation cases. You can't get jury trial for a defamation case anymore, realistically. So consequently, the only place that the juries still exist are very serious cases of where there's been a death in inquests, and that's at the discretion of the coroner, and in Crown Court cases, and they're trying to restrict even that in Crown Courts.
So tell me, what's gone wrong with our legal system? And I don't know whether you want to run through some of the court cases that you've brought with the Brexit one, and then obviously now with the grooming gangs, and also with the lockdowns.
Yes. So during Blair's time, Tony Blair and his government radically changed the infrastructure behind the legal system. Labour often are much cleverer at changing things than the Conservatives are. And he didn't sort of directly attack, but what he did was he went round the back and changed the sort of inner workings, as it were. And so, for instance, one of the things they did was they set up this sentencing council, which there was a row about recently because they were basically saying that there should be pre-sentence reports where there was any consideration of imprisonment for anybody who was black, minority, ethnic, LGBTQ+, but not for anybody else.
Everyone except for white people.
Effectively, yeah. And that was too much even for Labour, so they've actually asked for that to be changed, and are thinking of introducing a sort of backstop whereby a minister can intervene, because one of the things that Blair did was he removed a lot of decision making from the sort of democratic arena of House of Commons and put it into so-called Quangos, quasi-autonomous
non-governmental
organisations,
which are theoretically under the control of the government. However, they operate essentially independently, and it's a bureaucrat who essentially runs them. And how often do they actually report to Parliament?
Well, it varies from one to another, but generally speaking, they're not really under any immediate democratic control at all. And the appointments to the boards of these things is another issue, because, of course, it's all behind closed doors. It's all about political patronage, and there's no public get no chance of having any say on this. And of course, in the example of the sentencing council, we've recently had and there's an increasing furore over the sentencing of people who are simply tweeting, like Lucy Connolly over the Southport riots, and Keir Starmer and several government ministers have basically characterised what they were doing as far-right thuggery, a quote from him, even though there was no evidence of that. And it now turns out from the Inspector of Constabulary's report that there is actually no evidence that was the case at all.
Exactly.
And so Lucy Connolly, who simply tweeted something objectionable, she took it down after an hour or so. She's wound up with over 2.5 years immediate custodial imprisonment, whereas there have been cases where people have committed violent crimes, and in one case relatively recently, a Pakistani Muslim who was convicted of raping an underage girl, who got lesser prison sentences than somebody who simply tweeted something that actually didn't make any difference to anything that was going on.
And you see what they did to Peter Lynch.
Yeah. Well, and let's face it, he was simply taking part in a demonstration. He didn't do anything violent, as far as we're aware, and he certainly wasn't convicted of anything violent. So that's and he got over 3.5 years, didn't he? So, and that was part of the background to him committing suicide for basically shouting the sort of things at a demonstration that are a lot less than have been shouted almost every Saturday in London for month after month since Hamas attacked that pop concert in Israel. So I mean, you've got a really clear situation of two-tier justice, I think, and people are more and more recognising this.
How much control do government ministers have over the Quangos in terms of replacing their heads if they really want to? Is that possible, or is it a specific term?
So usually they're appointed for a period of time, and when the renewal of their contract comes up, the minister's going to be able to decide whether it's going to be extended or whether somebody else is going to be appointed in their place, and the minister will have a significant role in deciding who the next one's going to be. But just in case the minister was thinking that they might appoint somebody that Blair might not have approved of, there's then also another Quango which decides whether people are suitable for public appointments. And I was going to say in the law, we used to have a situation where people talk about the separation of powers, which is an American idea, not ours. And we had a figure whose job it was to sort of tie together all aspects of governance.
The Lord Chancellor.
The Lord Chancellor. So he was the leading judge. He's a politician. He was also a member of the cabinet and the one with most precedence. And he was also the equivalent of the Speaker of the House of Lords. So he was in the legislature, he was in the executive, and he was in the judiciary, in leading positions in all of those. So Blair was finding he was fed up with his old mentor, Lord Irvine, and he wanted to get rid of any restriction, really. And he particularly wanted to get rid of the Lord Chancellor's role in the selection of judges. And so basically what they've done is they've got rid of the Lord Chancellor. There's still somebody who holds a title.
Because they couldn't abolish the title because it's baked into so much legislation, it is impossible to abolish it.
Well, it would have involved an awful lot of work, much more work than Blair or his ministers or the MPs were willing to do. But the key thing about the appointment of the judiciary that's changed is that we used to have a system where the Lord Chancellor would be alerted by senior judges to a barrister that they thought could be appointed to the bench. In other words, somebody who was a good lawyer, knew his stuff, and would do a good job. So, in other words, the essential criteria was about being a good lawyer. That was the key to it. And we then wound up with judges who were either left or right. You didn't have a political test. What you had was judges who were thought to be good lawyers.
You could follow the golden thread,
and hopefully would. But also the result was that you'd got a judiciary that was not political. Blair didn't like that. So he's created an institution called the Judicial Appointments Commission. The commissioners are all stocked from the left of politics. And the Judicial Appointments Commission say that they won't even consider an application from somebody who wants to be a judge unless they can demonstrate a lifetime's commitment to equality and diversity.
A lifetime?
A lifetime.
So you can't meet the qualifications last year, the year before. You have to have been doing this your entire life. So you have to have been a party member for your entire existence.
Yeah, so I mean, for instance, I think you could take it as an example of that. Lady Hale, the spider lady who became the president of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, by the way, is another Blair creation.
Which is
intended to take the judges out of the House of Lords so that they can't criticise government for not following proper legal procedures, which is what was happening in the House of Lords in the old days.
Well, it's very interesting with the so-called Supreme Court because it's dubious whether it's legitimate, considering that it has to rule on Parliament, and it's thought to be inside Parliament, but it's not actually inside Parliament. And given the Bill of Rights, Parliament can't be questioned by courts outside of Parliament, apart from the people in a revolution. So do you think the so-called Supreme Court is actually supreme? Do you think it's actually legitimate? Can it actually function in that role?
Well, I think the test with any legal system is whether people accept it. In fact, it's not actually whether it properly fits with constitutional principles. If people accept it, then it is obviously working. I think what's, however, is gradually happening is that people are accepting things less and less. So there is, as some commentators have been pointing out, like Professor Betts, the professor of war in the modern world at King's College London. He's saying that we are likely to be in civil war within 5 years, which is a very alarming concept. But the basic thing that he's saying is that the legitimacy of the British state is breaking down, and I can see that as being true, actually, that it is breaking down, and it's partly simple awareness by people that the system's not on our side, but it's also partly the total inefficiency of almost anything. Whenever I have to deal with anything to do with the state, I'm amazed at just how totally incompetent almost everybody is that you come across. And of course, the reason for that is that they haven't actually been selected because they're any good at the job. They've been selected because they tick box multiculturalist tokenism. And they know that, so they know they don't have to do the job. They are obviously always going to tick box that. But I was talking about Lady Hale, wasn't I, and her background.
The spider, yes.
So she became, in effect, the most senior judge in the entire hierarchy of judges when she became the president of the Supreme Court. However, she hadn't been a barrister practicing in the courts. She was an academic. She was a lecturer at Cambridge. I don't think she was even a senior lecturer at Cambridge, but I may be wrong on that. But she certainly wasn't a professor. And she wasn't reckoned to be a particularly bright, shining star in legal academia. The thing that she'd got going for her was that she was a long-standing feminist activist. And I think she was also a member of the Labour Party, which probably helped.
And if I'm right, I believe she was the one who believed that she had the right to prevent the prorogation of Parliament.
That's correct. She was on that.
Because it would be royal prerogative, would it not? That the Prime Minister, using the power of the monarch, could prorogue Parliament.
Yes. So that has been the constitutional position since there was a Parliament. Going back into the Middle Ages. It's not a new proposition that the monarchy can prorogue Parliament unchallenged. And the High Court ruled when it looked at this on the traditional basis, which is under the Bill of Rights of 1689. The courts are not supposed to inquire into or obstruct in any way proceedings in Parliament, that's been the position ever since then, ever since the Glorious Revolution. It was the position really beforehand as well, but it didn't get sort of written down in that way. And there she comes along and says, "Oh no, with a very thin judgment, which doesn't have any sort of history to it at all, really."
Or one might say repugnant, ultra vires, beyond her power.
Well, but you see, my point was that law is often people accepting the judgment's been, and that's what happened. People accepted the judgment, and Boris then found another way out because he managed to get the Parliament to vote to allow him to call a general election. So we haven't wound up with a constitutional crisis over that. However, what we have got is a judiciary that have stepped into the political arena. But that's not surprising when you think that they are selected, as I was saying, because of a lifetime's commitment to equality and diversity. And she was a prime example of somebody who had been selected to be a judge, a High Court judge, and promoted all the way up the system, because she was a social justice warrior.
It's been fantastic. The stage is the best stage I've ever performed on. The people were fantastic, just being here, everything about this place, the freedom people, the crazy flat earthers, everyone, it's fantastic.
Here we are at the beautiful festival with this wonderful Gaunt's house run by Eccentric. He likes the rough and ready nature of people who are genuine.
Join a host of speakers including Tess Laurie, UK Colin, Richard Vobes, Clive DeCarle, Mark Devlin and more at what may be the Freedom Festival of the Year, Sounds Beautiful, June 26th and 29th. Not forgetting amazing music by Victorious, Raw Milk Conspiracy, Slipknot, Matt Hoy, Soon T, Boom by Fire, Malcolm Cruz and more. Book now. So you have this politically motivated blob that's been created through these Quangos. How many Quangos are there, do you know?
I don't know, but hundreds.
Hundreds and hundreds of these Quangos. There's no way they can possibly have oversight of them. They're given on patronage. They then select other political appointments. And if you actually do manage to get power, then there's actually a Quango there to select the other Quangos, like something out of Yes Minister. There's a Quango for the Quangos.
Even Yes Minister didn't think of something as complicated as that.
Well, the thing is, Minister, it's very nice that you would like to select someone else to be in charge of the Quangos, but you need to go to a Quango in order to select the person to be in charge of the Quango.
Yeah. So the only way to deal with all of that would actually be to legislate. And you'd have to legislate to get rid of them, the Quangos.
Complete abolition of all of them.
Well, not all of them in one go, because obviously some you would probably want to keep. But the ones that were involved in regulating politics, you'd want to get rid of, I would think.
Isn't there some sort of problem with Quangos being able to act without ministerial oversight? Surely these should be, directly controlled bodies, so they're completely accountable to the government and therefore the government minister. Because the idea is, you elect your member of parliament, they form a government. Hopefully, if it's your team that wins, they form a government. From the prime minister, you go down. You've got the cabinet. Below the cabinet, you've got all of the other ministers within their departments or ministries, and below that, you have the civil servants, and they run everything. So whether they're running, the forestry, or this or that, the idea is there's a direct chain of command, and someone is responsible, and someone gets sacked. And there is meant to be some sort of political cost to someone at the top. I think most of the reason we wanted to leave the EU was because, or much of it was because our politicians said, oh, no, it's the EU's fault, and the EU went, oh, no, it's your politicians' fault, and there was no accountability.
Yeah.
And there's no accountability here. So should we not get rid of every single Quango, or at least get rid of them as Quangos and put them under ministerial control?
So I like your theory of how there ought to be democratic control, but that hasn't been the way things have been operating now for a long time, and certainly since Blair. I mean, Blair was very keen on creating a sort of, well, the Americans would call it a sort of deep state, wouldn't they? But he was very keen on creating a state which was not subject to democratic whims and wills of the population, I think that sort of slightly brings us back to our point about the attitude to the English people, because the system is not responsive to the will of the majority. Obviously, when you talk about democracy, people talk about majorities. But very rarely are the majority. So if you think about people that get elected as MPs, they are usually not voted for by the majority of people in their constituency. I first had a look at this when we were going to stand in Henley after Boris Johnson stood down as an MP to become the London mayor. And Henley apparently, the Conservatives were claiming that Henley had been Conservative for 120 years, which is rather strange when you think that the Conservative Party as it stands at the moment only came into existence in 1922, but there we are. That's what they were claiming. The upshot was that when you actually analyse the figures, the Conservatives had only ever had the votes of about 35% of the electorate in recent times. And so what you got was a situation where people had voted for others, but they didn't vote for any of the others to the same extent as they voted for the Conservatives. So the Conservative got elected on 35% of the vote, not of the electorate.
Exactly. Well, Starmer got in on, what was it, around 30% of the vote, and I believe it was only 20% of the electorate.
Yes. And curiously, it's about just short of 9.5 million, I think, people voted for Labour, which, from the point of view of an English nationalist, does have some comfort buried in it, because the last but one census, they had put the question of are you English only, more or less at the top of the list, and something like 65% of people had said they were English only. Tick that box. So this time they didn't like that outcome, so what they'd done was they'd buried English only right down at the bottom of the list. And quite a lot of people had then searched through to find English only and ticked that. And that was over 9.5 million people that did that in England only, obviously. Whereas Starmer's vote is the whole UK. But in England, of course, a significant proportion more, or significant number more, ticked the box for English only, however buried it was. And that was more than had voted for Starmer.
So if everyone who had selected English only on the census voted English Democrat tomorrow, you'd be in government.
Well, we would have to stand 600 candidates, of course, which would be quite hard work to manage. We did manage to stand 106 some years ago, and that was hard work getting to that. But yes, I mean, in principle, you're right, and we would like to do that, but I don't think the hour is ours just at the moment, frankly.
Well, talking a little bit about elections and demographics, how many of Labour's voters were actually English or British? How many of them were foreigners? Because right now we've got foreigners voting in our elections, which essentially makes those elections illegitimate, because you cannot have a democracy without the demos voting. And these aren't the demos, you know. It's like saying Axel Rudakabana, this what was it, Rwandan or something, this African, is supposedly a Welshman.
A Welsh choir boy, don't forget.
Oh, a choir boy. Well, I've got my great-great-grandfather's mining lamp on my desk from the Welsh Valleys.
Yeah.
It's an insult.
Yeah.
How many do you think? And how many millions of votes that Labour got in that election?
Well, we do sort of have the answer to the point that you're making, and it's a very good point. Because in Rotherham, where obviously the child rape gangs first got exposed, officially at any rate, what then came out was that the former Labour MP for Rotherham, Dennis McShane, said on a TV interview that that when he had first become the MP for Rotherham, he discovered that this was going on, and he raised it with senior people within the Labour Party, and he was told to shut up because what was important was to keep the block vote of the Pakistani Muslim community, so we do know that they do rely upon the block vote of Pakistani Muslim community and many other communities. And after all, the whole thrust of the development of multiculturalism, which they've been behind, is to empower and consolidate these various separate communities. In other words, their whole thrust has been against integration and into segregation. And that's not entirely surprising, because that is exactly what the Soviets did in the Soviet Union. They had a system which was based upon community representation. The centre would choose who represented each community, and that meant, of course, that individual was beholden to the centre and knew that all their privileges and comfortable lifestyle and everything else depended upon keeping the centre happy with them. So it was a highly successful way of controlling the politics, but for the fact that their economic system was hopeless and didn't work, and they were unable to manage to keep up with American technological development, Western technological development, not just American. They eventually got to a point where they were not able to cope. And in fact, I think the thing that really sort of pushed them over was going to Afghanistan, where the Afghans managed to beat the Soviet army.
That was
in
back the
Afghanistan.
first time that the Taliban were our friends, and then they were our enemies, and now we're friends again, apparently, or something
Yes,
like that.
you're right. And in fact, of course, the Americans armed and trained the Taliban to fight the Soviets.
So it was divide and conquer by the Soviets, and that's what they're essentially using here then,
Yeah.
with the migration, to bring in an
Divide.
anti-demos, essentially, to weaken our representation and weaken our culture. So they're playing divide and conquer.
Yeah.
So what needs to be done to solve this? Because we currently are being occupied by a sizable number of people. Millions of people in this country have moved here. Many of those people have residency. Millions upon millions of people have been given paper citizenship, even though they don't have any British bloodline at all. And they've not even been adopted. Most of them haven't even married in, so they're not even honorary British. What do you believe needs to be done to deal with this problem in terms of our electoral system?
Obviously, the first thing that needs to be done is to get out the two and a half parties that have facilitated all of this, because nothing can be done whilst they're still in power. Obviously, if Professor Betts is right, that might well wind up not being through the ballot box. But if it is through the ballot box, which would be certainly the preferable option, then even so, they need to be got out, because they are sucking the lifeblood out of the nation.
But once they are got out, and it may be violent, it may be peaceful, I believe we have a right to revolution where the government is illegitimate. Of course, every person has that as their, every people have that as their natural right. How are we going to deal with the problem that we've got a bunch of people with a piece of paper saying that they're British who aren't British? And how are we going to differentiate, and how are we going to, sort our country out, because we're currently occupied?
So you're talking about legal points.
Yes.
So at the moment, the law says that such a person is British, but the law doesn't have to say that. So it could be changed. It would be changed. I think that would be at a moment at which things would get fairly intense, I suspect. I mean, what Professor Betts, as I understand it, has been predicting isn't a civil war in the sense of the English Civil War, where you've got the Roundheads with the Cavaliers, or the American Civil War with the North and the South fighting.
So no fancy outfits.
He's not suggesting that, no. What he's suggesting is something more like Lebanon, where you've got communities that are completely separate, that hate each other, and if any one from one community goes into another community's area, they're very likely to be killed. And that is a very alarming thought. It's also a thought that if that were to happen, it might not be ever solved. It might take a very long time to be solved. And obviously Lebanon's been degenerating into more and more chaos. And that's now been going on for decades. And I think it is worth pointing out, as you're sort of alluding to mass immigration, what actually tipped Lebanon over in the first place was mass immigration, because they accepted a very large number of Palestinian refugees, who then basically overthrew the country and started attacking, in particular, the Christians who had been the majority in Lebanon.
Yeah, because Lebanon used to be a Christian country in the Middle East.
It did.
So, essentially, if we don't change course, we're going to end up in a balkanised system where it will be essentially a kill or be killed by these multiple populations warring with each other.
It's worse than the Balkans. The Balkans never quite dissolved into what we're describing here. This is Lebanon or Libya, where you've got tribal groups killing each other.
And it will essentially become a situation where tribes are trying to wipe each other out.
That's right. That's what he's saying. I'm not a professor of the study of war in the modern world, so I can't say whether that will happen. But he did certainly paint a picture which I think is consistent with what you can see in history and in other countries, where things have degenerated to the point where it's difficult to recover from it. And one of the things that he was saying is that the various problems that we've been talking about with the way the British state operates, including its lack of democracy and its willingness to replace the original peoples with others, and then call that democracy, that those things are flashpoints, according to Professor Betts, for trouble, basically, and they undermine the legitimacy of the state. And you reach a point where the state no longer has any legitimacy at all, and people then won't do what the state tells it to do, or tells them to do, unless the state can apply force. Well, the idea of the British state applying force, when we've got the smallest army that's existed since the Napoleonic era, there's now, I think, 73,000 soldiers.
Do you think the rank and file would obey?
I'm not sure, but some would.
But a lot wouldn't. I mean, the sort of person that joins the army is someone who's nationalistic. That's how they get people to go and die for them.
Yes. Not entirely, because, of course, the British Army is currently building up, for instance, the Gurkhas, who are not like that. They are not about nationalism. They are, in effect, a legacy from empire.
The Gurkhas are so loyal. My great-grandfather fought alongside the Gurkhas.
But who are they loyal to? I mean, if you were talking about a sort of civil war situation, I think they would obey what remained of government, wouldn't they?
Really?
Don't you?
I think that the Gurkhas would side with us if they were. They have British officers, and there are low-ranking British officers. I think those low-ranking British officers would be loath to use the Gurkhas against the British people, and I think the Gurkhas love the British people. I do think they have a deep respect, and an admiration of us. Therefore, I think if they were used against the British people themselves, I think they'd take their kukris and maybe throw them the other way.
Well, that would be encouraging if that happened. I think it is just worth remembering, though, that during the time of empire, they were trotted out when there was trouble with the local population. I think I'm right in saying that it was Gurkhas that were used at the massacre at Amaretsa, wasn't it?
Armistice, yes. I'm not 100% sure.
And I remember reading as a boy John Masters' autobiography of him being an officer in a Gurkha regiment, and I think they were used for sort of police operations, in effect.
So you think that the Gurkhas, because of obviously all of the tradition and respect that we have for them, can be used as a Trojan horse of a foreign army, essentially, that would be happy to turn against the population of this country?
Possibly. I mean, it is worth thinking how the Romans operated. The Roman army in Britain was 2 legions generally throughout the period of Roman occupation. And 1 legion was recruited in North Africa, and the other legion was recruited in Syria, which is a much wider area than it is now. And St George was one of the Syrian soldiers, I think thought to have been a legate, in other words, an officer within the Syrian legion, and came to some prominence because his general rebelled and became the emperor Diocletian. So certainly one thought about St George's career was that he was actually based in Britain, in the province of Britain, and his commander then became emperor. But it didn't save him, because when he disobeyed the emperor over being a Christian, he was then tortured to death. And the Romans were very inventive about torturing people. But what I'm saying is that armies that are not composed of local people do tend to obey their orders rather than show any sign of sympathy with the local people that they're sent out to control. But we got into that point because I was saying that actually the British Army is far too small. You couldn't imagine 73,000, which includes cooks and pay clerks and so on, and not fighting soldiers, could control a population of tens of millions.
Especially during a chaotic period when they'd be worried about their families, because their families.
They'd be worried about their families, absolutely. But what happens with small armies that are put in trying to be put in charge of big conurbations was seen very vividly in Iraq, where the British Army was defeated by the insurgents in Iraq.
So you think there could possibly be an insurgency? I mean, they have taken a lot of weapons off of people, but there still are a few million firearms left in the country.
Well, there certainly was most firearms, of course, are in the possession of criminals now, aren't they? What?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily call those people criminals. There are a lot of people who have weapons tucked away.
Yes, but I mean, they tend to be used in drug crimes and things like that, don't they?
A shocking number of farmers have shotguns. A shocking number of people in the countryside have guns.
A shotgun isn't very useful against a rifle. Having been a soldier for a little while, I could say that with absolute certainty.
But it's what you've got when you start out, and it's about having something.
So in Iraq, the sort of things that people were using to cause the British Army to trouble weren't rifles, and the rifles were used.
IEDs.
But there were bombs, and that anybody who knows anything technological can make a bomb. Quite often, soldiers were killed simply by bricks being chucked off the top of buildings. Something as simple as that. It's not difficult.
Oh, that would be awfully messy.
Well, if you've got a built-up area, what I'm saying is that it's very difficult to control. particularly if you've got lots of blocks of flats and things like that.
Yeah, and if people have to resort to using bombs, though, you can imagine the collateral damage.
And in Northern Ireland, after all, this an insurgency went on for decades, and as time went on, the IRA had better and better weapons.
They're receiving a lot of support from the Americans.
But they were then able to buy. They were then able to buy better, more and more sophisticated weapons. So, I mean, if you are talking about if Professor Betts is talking about a situation where central authority breaks down, it won't be long before people are starting to buy more sophisticated weapons. He was actually saying that that what might happen in the cities is that key infrastructure gets attacked. So, for instance, if an insurgent group wanted to undermine the way that a city operates, they would attack the power,
Water,
sewage,
gas as well.
gas. I was sort of including that in power, but it's not just electricity. It's all sources of power.
So that's where we can end up. But
hopefully we don't.
With a balkanised population, what do you think of Enoch Powell's plan, the voluntary repatriation, giving them their Danegeld, if you will, but closing the borders? So the ones who will never integrate will just take the money and leave. The ones who have something invested here might choose to stay and reject the money. A sort of test, if you will.
Well, if you had a government in power that was willing and able to do that, I'm sure that would work. But the trouble is we haven't got any such government in power that's able and willing to do that. So consequently, we can't immediately see our path to anything like that happening.
Well, one problem you might say is the electoral system. What's your take on it? Do you believe in the majoritarian system, or do you believe in something more proportionally representative, something with a stronger codified constitution that has strict limits on government?
So, in terms of the electoral system, what we've got at the moment, as I was saying really about Henley, is a situation where the government could be elected on a relatively small proportion of the support, and that government then becomes, talk about itself as being the majority, because it's got a majority in the House of Commons, but it might be doing things, and indeed I'd say the current government is doing things that are against the will of the majority of the population. And there isn't any legal comeback on that. So we have got a system which is dysfunctional. It has been dysfunctional for decades now. At one point, people used to talk about a sort of pendulum with politics, so that you get a bit of left-wing politics, and then at the next election, you then get the pendulum would swing back, and you get some right-wing politics, and then the next one would be left, and so on. That certainly hasn't worked for a long while, and of course part of the reason it hasn't worked is because the Conservatives were increasingly not a right-wing party in any meaningful sense, and a sort of a fairly extreme example of that really was Theresa May, who was very clearly hostile to patriotic sentiment in any way, and she was also very keen on net zero, and was a supporter of all the lockdown and all the rest of it. So she was a liberal globalist.
Well, I'd say socialist globalist,
Possibly,
but
yeah, progressive globalist. Let's go with that, shall we?
yeah, I don't like the attacks on the word liberalism. I think it's a sort of Orwellian attack on our language, and if we give them that term in and of itself, it gives them a cloak under which to hide.
The only thing is that liberal philosophy does suggest the idea that all human beings are the same, and that the difference between us is upbringing and economic and social factors. So it is part of the underpinning of the idea that society can be changed in any which way that the authorities want.
You say this, but it depends. Are you going by the English definition of liberalism, which I would say liberalism, life, liberty, property, or are you going by the French conception, which I wouldn't really call liberalism? I mean, under liberalism, you have this conception of nationalism, this property over the nation, which I don't believe that people emphasise at all. Like, you would consider the nation to essentially be a freehold of the people who live in it. You would consider national or local government to be the best form of government, some sort of subsidiarity, to be the best because it's closest to the individual rather than being this top-down globalist approach. Surely under liberalism, you do get the conception that certain people are mad. We've always had people who are considered lunatics or insane and cannot exert a capacity, cannot own property. There's personhood, legal personhood, which can be lost. And you wouldn't necessarily have people claiming rights to someone else's country unless that country were so in violation of natural law that they had no legitimacy to control it.
Yes, I'm not sure whether liberal philosophers do agree with the idea of natural law. That seems to be
Locke.
Yes, but Locke is certainly one of those philosophers that is very unpopular nowadays.
Algernon Sidney?
I think Locke is the philosopher of property, and he's also key to the thinking of the Glorious Revolution. His thinking is, I think, very important in why England had the first industrial revolution, and his thinking is also very important in the foundation of the United States of America and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But I think for a long time now he's not been so popular this side of the Atlantic, and in many ways that's a pity. But I liked what you were saying about liberalism, but I just don't think that is actually the way that liberalism is applied in the world today. I think liberalism is turned into a sort of analysis that human beings are all the same, and I think we round up with an extreme example of what a mess that can create in Iraq after George W. Bush had gone in and taken over Iraq and knocked out the dictatorship, because the neocons, who are liberals in the sense that I think most people would be, who are interested in politics, would be talking about, they thought that if you took out the dictatorship, that Iraqis would want to be nice little middle Americans, get on with business and live happily with their neighbours. Whereas in fact, of course, what turned out was that when you took away the dictatorship, all the grievances of the different communities were completely unrestrained, and they began to kill each other. I think that kind of thought about the way human beings are at bedrock runs the risk of people thinking that human beings are sort of fundamentally always nice, and it's only sort of society that makes them nasty. So they think that if you change society, you then wind up with everybody being nice, and you can have people from all over the world and all different cultures living happily together in what's not even a melting pot, because they don't want them to become integrated. And I think we're probably going to find that experiment doesn't work. And certainly that's what, in effect, Professor Betts is saying. He's saying that you reach a point where you've got no longer a coherent society, and at that point, things become dangerous.
I honestly, I couldn't agree more. But simply what I would be positing is that throughout the heart of true liberalism, which I would say is the core, you talked about the British Empire being a fundamentally liberal empire, it wasn't necessarily about giving everyone democracy, giving everyone a right to vote. That's not necessarily democracy. It was about giving people fundamental rights to live their lives freely, which one would consider far more important. I mean, traditionally in this country, most people can vote. And it's only been, 100 years or something like that?
Yep.
It's not been very long, but people fundamentally...
1927, I think.
Yeah, and if you look at the men's votes as well, are coming in.
Yes.
The working class men. So most people didn't have a right to vote, but they were very proud of being English because they fundamentally had rights under the law, and they could only be really convicted of a significant crime by the lawful judgment of their peers, and that was considered to be far more significant than taking a piece of paper and putting it in a box once every 3-5 years.
An example of the liberal empire, of the British Empire, is actually the scramble for Africa. In the 19th century, there was a period of time where the European powers started to take bits of Africa as part of their empire. What happened was that in England in particular, there became a very strong abolitionist movement to abolish slavery, and that initially succeeded in abolishing the slave trade, and the Royal Navy was then used to suppress the slave trade, and then later slavery itself was abolished throughout British-controlled territories. But what they were then finding was, of course, that the slave trade was carrying on within Africa. And after all, before European traders had arrived in West Africa, the West Africans had been selling their neighbours to Arab traders.
Oh yeah, the Africans loved their slavery, and they were the ones who really owe the reparations to all the West Indians. And why shouldn't Africa pay if we're going to have some reparations?
So what then happened was that British officials thought that the only way of suppressing the slave trade was to take over the bits of Africa that had the slave trade going on. Of course, that's why Gordon was in Khartoum, because he was there to try and suppress the slave trade. Because one of the routes of the slave trade was into the Sudan and Ethiopia.
This beautiful,
not Ethiopia, Somalia.
Beautiful painting is The Last Stand, isn't it? With all of the Mahdi army coming in.
But isn't it interesting that the Mahdi army, which I think you probably see nowadays portrayed as freedom fighters, were pro-slavery.
Yeah,
and they were fighting to maintain slavery in the Sudan.
But they don't want to talk about those parts of history, do they?
No.
So, in terms of fixing our democracy or our electoral system, what do you posit needs to be done? Do we need to move to PR?
So I think that what's likely to happen is that if reform carries on winning, you'll probably find that the Conservatives and Labour get into another sort of pact to work behind the scenes to change things so that it advantages themselves. I mean, we saw this in May, where the Conservatives and Labour had done a dodgy deal to stop 10 of the county councils having elections. Well, there's nothing to stop them changing the electoral system. And if they can devise an electoral system that helps them more than the first past the post, I think you can be fairly clear that they will do that. After we do now live in a continent where politicians that are thought to be inconvenient to the establishment get banned from standing or winning elections, don't they?
And you see very dodgy things happening in this country on election night.
We do.
So
We have for a long while. So when we won the mayoralty of Doncaster some years ago, and when the first round of vote counting had concluded, it looked like Labour had done rather well, but it hadn't done well enough to resist the call for a recount, and very reluctantly the returning officer agreed a recount in an area that, after all, had been one-party Labour state for a long while. And when they did the recount, they then found, I think it was 5,000 BNP votes in the Labour pile. And once those were taken out of the Labour pile, Labour wasn't even in the running to win the mayoralty.
was anybody imprisoned?
Of course not.
So there are no consequences.
Well, they've been doing it for a long while.
And these are the vote counters. We've had multiple
Yeah.
people talk about elections being rigged.
Yes.
These people are indoctrinated.
Well, Stalin had a comment, didn't he, which is, doesn't matter how you vote or who you vote for or how many times you vote, what matters is who counts the votes.
How widespread do you think it is?
Oh, I think it's pretty widespread. When one of our sort of leading figures on this is a judge, but he's not a full-time judge, but he's the judge of the Electoral Court, Sir Richard Morney. I think he's now retired, but he's been saying for a long while that our electoral system wouldn't disgrace a banana republic.
It's that corrupt.
Yeah. And we had this with the mayoralty of Tower Hamlets, and in his finding he reckoned that more than half of all the votes that were put in that election were fraud.
Wow. So across the country, the electoral landscape could be completely different.
It is. I do think it's a particular Labour one-party state area. I don't get the impression that conservative one-party state areas do this. I wouldn't be entirely confident about the Lib Dems because they are neither liberal nor democratic. But in other words, it is part of sort of leftist tradition, really, to
Rig elections.
rig elections. Yes.
So what can be done about it? Because there's a problem with the chain of custody. There's the problem with, challenging it and even getting close enough to have a recount in the first place. Because if they rig it by enough, then it can't be contested.
Well, it's also the issue of returning officers. The returning officers are appointed, in effect, by the ruling party in your local area.
Yeah.
And they then get to appoint all the counters of the votes and all the people who supervise the actual voting. And one of our elections in Doncaster, we had quite an interesting situation, which I think tells you something of the problem, because there was a ward which it seemed quite likely we were going to win, and we did win in most of the polling stations. However, there was one polling station which had a much higher turnout, it appeared, than any of the others. And when we actually looked at the, because you can look at the marked register, which tells who's voted. When we looked at the marked register, it turned out that there were something like 9 or 10 pages of the register for that polling station. And the first, I think, 6 pages there was 100% turnout. And of course, those people had mostly voted Labour, it turned out. And in one case, we had a solicitor who said that he'd been on holiday at the time and hadn't voted, but he was hadn't actually voted, but he was noted down as having voted.
And was that challenged and overturned?
Well, the snag is you have to bring the answer, short answers now. You have to bring the election petition within 21 days. In order to launch an election petition, you have to pay a court fee of £5,000. And what had happened in this particular case is that we had asked to see the papers straight away. But the returning officer then came out with all sorts of reasons why we couldn't see it. And we didn't actually get to see the papers until 18 days after the election. So at that point, it would have been next to impossible to have organised to do an electoral petition.
So the returning officers just appears to be corrupt.
Well, I'll give you an even more extreme example, actually. The last parliamentary by-election for Westminster during the Gordon Brown period of Prime Ministership was in Glenrothes in Scotland. There had been a series of by-elections where the SNP had won them, and you got a more or less identical pattern of the change in where people were going to vote. In Glenrothes, the opinion polls were saying it was going to be exactly the same. What that meant was that Labour had to find an extra 6,000 votes. It became, their original thought was, well, let's just bury the bad news. So they did the election for the day after the American presidential election. But then it became clear that, to Gordon Brown that if he lost the election, bear in mind it was a constituency right next to his constituency, if he lost the election, then he was likely to be ousted. So it became critical to win it. And on the day, the exit polls showed SNP had won it. But in fact, Labour won it because they'd found an extra 6,000 votes. To cut a long story short, it turned out that the way they found that was by getting people to register for postal votes who lived everywhere else in the country. They'd never even been to Glenrothes. And that's a fairly extreme example of changing the demography, isn't it?
So what hope is there if the elections are just...
Oh, hang on. Let me just finish that particular one. Because obviously the SNP then thought this was extraordinary, and what's more, they thought they'd got them at it, at electoral corruption. And so they called for the papers. And the returning officer in that case then told them that all the papers had disappeared.
Awfully convenient. So what hope is there if our electoral system is just so completely corrupt with how the votes are counted?
Well,
or forged?
Obviously, the hope isn't as great as it would be if you could be sure that everything would be counted. What certainly needs to happen with an insurgent party who's hoping to break through is that they need to have a lot of vote observers, and they need to be very much in evidence, checking what's going on, making sure that there aren't politically motivated people running the polling stations that then vote for people that didn't turn up.
They need to fundraise, I guess, as well.
They need a lot of funds to do.
And be ready to launch all of their legal challenges the minute the election closes.
Yes.
You just bring any of the suspect ones and you just gun for it. Yeah. And be willing to lose 5,000 here, there and everywhere.
Yeah, you need to be able to do that, yes. And
So that's the way that they
and
price everyone else out the system.
Yeah, well, yes. The system is after all been designed by the establishment parties to advantage themselves. It hasn't been designed to be a pure democratic system at all. And the first past the post, after all, which is not a tradition that goes back, into the dawn of time.
We used to have multi-member
We
constituencies.
used to have multi-member constituencies in many constituencies, and
There was 2 Knights of the Shire and 2 burgesses, and then in certain cities they increased it to 5, and then I believe at some later point they went to 7 or 9 or something like that.
And the voting was originally done openly, so everybody could see how you voted. It wasn't done secretly.
I am partial to that idea.
So the consequence was that everybody could see who'd voted for who, and if the result appeared different from what everybody could see, it could be challenged and would be challenged.
Do we need to move back to that system of public voting?
I certainly think one of the worst problems is postal voting. There's a lot of fraud associated with postal voting, like we were saying with Sir Richard Morley's comments. But there's also not only a lot of fraud, but the establishment parties have observers watching when the postal votes are open, and they then know what the outcome is going to be, and they can then work on changing it. And I mean, quite a good example of us seeing what kind of impact that had, it was in the Brexit vote, because Cameron and the Remainers were all very sort of relaxed and confident when they thought they were going to win, because all the propaganda had been on their side, hadn't it? But then they saw the postal votes, and they realised that they weren't going to win. So we then had a sort of a load of hysteria at the last moment. And the same again in the Scottish independence referendum. They were fairly relaxed about it. Then the postal votes were seen, and Cameron started promising all sorts of additional goodies to the Scots not to vote for independence.
So would you abolish postal voting?
I think, except in most compelling circumstances, people shouldn't be allowed to vote, except in person.
Okay.
And I'll give you another area where there's a big problem, and that is old people's homes.
Yep, they go and harvest them.
They do, yes. And many of the old people who are voting in every election have advanced Alzheimer's.
Yeah, completely senile. And their carers.
And their carers are the ones that are voting. Yeah. Well, in fact, management.
What do you think about people having a vote for their children? If people have got children? Parents being able to vote on behalf of their children?
Well, maybe. I don't know if anybody's suggested that as yet, have they? I haven't heard it suggested before.
Interesting conversation.
It is.
The children exist. They're British, actually British, rather than Welsh choir boys.
Of course, it wouldn't. You'd have to have already had the change in the voting system before that could be made to work. So at the moment, it would be achieving the opposite result.
It would be temporarily, but I think all of these things need to happen at the same time.
Well,
don't
Labour
they?
has announced that they are intending to allow voting for 16-year-olds.
God, so that'll be even more foreigners voting.
Possibly, but the thing that they are perhaps not fully appreciating is that part of the reason why the Brexit vote went the way it did was because younger people who were thought to be mostly not wanting Brexit at the time didn't vote. And that is a standard pattern of behaviour, that young people don't tend to vote by comparison to the older people. The older people are much more inclined to vote, which of course is part of the reason why you wind up with all sorts of policies which are more advantageous to the elderly than to the young.
So they're going to subject us not only to the votes of foreigners, but the votes of children, the votes of dead people, the votes of senile people.
We're already subject to those.
So what do you think? Should we go to additional member system, or should we go fully proportional?
Well, we've said proportional voting. What you then wind up with is all the various different strands of opinion get represented in Parliament. You then wind up with a much more of a debate about all the options and all the ways of thinking about problems than we do at the moment with our system, where many voices are cut out from being able to talk about what goes on in Parliament. The criticism of that is that you then wind up with a coalition.
Grand coalitions.
You can wind up with a grand coalition, and that can be a problem, and you can wind up with sort of repetitive patterns of coalitions being created so that you don't really get much change.
But at least you have a foot in the door and you have a voice.
You have a foot in the door, you have a voice, and you also have a situation where the bargaining between the coalition members is more open. So we've got some idea of what's going on. So we've got some idea, for instance, with the German coalition, what bargains the new Chancellor's been making with the Social Democrat Party in order to get them to go in with him. And it's exposed some of the sort of backroom deals. But these backroom deals happen here. It's just that they're not exposed because they happen within the sort of grand coalition that is the Conservative Party or the Labour Party.
So, tell me about your recent court cases.
Yes. So the case we're working on at the moment is an application for judicial review, and we're challenging the Home Office's refusal to order a national statutory inquiry into the child rape gangs. I think that's not only an extremely important issue because of the systematic and sort of industrial scale that we're talking about here, because these rape gangs have been operating in at least 50 towns and cities, it turns out. The numbers of girls who've been raped as children are huge. Sarah Champion, the MP for Rotherham, has said it could be up to 1 million. I think that's probably too much, and she may be trying to confuse the issue between various different paedophiles rather than just the specific Pakistani Muslim contingent.
It's still on a gargantuan scale.
I think if you just restrict it to Pakistani Muslim child rape gangs, you're probably going to be at 250,000 girls across all those towns and cities.
Can you imagine that? 250,000 lives.
250,000 lives ruined. Yes. I was the solicitor bringing a case for a victim. We were trying to do the sort of icebreaker, showing that it can be done and it should be done. And we got a judgment for £426,000 for her for 2 rapes when she was 14, I think. One of the extraordinary things is that we've now had more than 500 of these child rapists convicted, but they haven't all been sued. But many of them are rich.
Are you suing the rapists?
Yeah.
For damages. Are you also suing the government for facilitating it in many cases?
So you can't sue the government for facilitating it.
You can't sue the government for facilitating rape.
No, because you would have to prove things that would be difficult to prove, and also you'd be restricted on time limits, which you're not with suing the perpetrator once they're convicted.
I see.
So a convicted perpetrator who has assets and a victim that wants to sue, we can do it, and we should do it.
And how many of these have you done?
So I've done one as an icebreaker to show exactly what needs to be done.
When did this come through?
We are trying to set up systems that enable us to do it for every girl that wants to bring their perpetrator to justice. That's the ideal. But can I come back to the judicial review?
Yes. Sorry, but this is fantastic. Yes, tell me more.
So the point is that the government has come up with all sorts of reasons why they don't want it to do institute a national statutory inquiry, and those reasons are, all sorts of things that are nothing whatsoever to do with the legal test here, because under the Inquiries Act, the test is whether there's public concern or whether there will be public concern. So obviously this is a situation where there is enormous public concern, and so we ought to be able to get an order requiring the setting up of a statutory inquiry. The importance of a statutory inquiry is it has teeth, because what it means is you'll have a judge, a High Court judge, placed in charge of the inquiry, and they can compel witnesses to attend under subpoena. If they don't attend, they'll go to prison. If they don't answer questions, they go to prison. If they don't produce documents when ordered to do so, they go to prison. So we could bear in mind that this is an enormous criminal conspiracy. We need to have a statutory inquiry. No other system of inquiry makes any sense whatsoever. And of course, all the evidence that's produced from a statutory inquiry can then be used as part of criminal proceedings or civil proceedings or regulatory proceedings. So we've had a good example of how a statutory inquiry can work recently, which is the Horizon inquiry into the post office. And the upshot of that is that all the senior people have been compelled to come along and explain what they got up to, and their misdoings have been exposed. There's consideration now of prosecutions, and as far as the lawyers are concerned, they're all in trouble with their regulators with a view to possibly having them struck off.
So that sounds excellent, but I think the one difficulty there seems to be here in your case is you're asking a judge to place an obligation upon a government minister to hold an inquiry. And you're saying that the test what piece of statute gives you the power to place an obligation on a minister to hold an inquiry?
It's the Inquiries Act 2005.
Sorry, okay, so you can actually oblige an inquiry to be conducted?
Well, nobody has actually done this. So, and that's because, of course, ministers are generally very keen to hold inquiries because they want to be showing that they're reacting to public concern. But what ministers need to be considering in whether to have a public inquiry, and I'm reading from the Act here, is A, particular events have caused or are capable of causing public concern, or B, there is public concern that particular events may have occurred. Full stop. No other grounds for consideration.
So that's what ministers should consider, but wouldn't it be within at the minister's discretion whether they hold an inquiry or not? Is there any wording which is more explicit?
The wording talks in the sort of language that you're thinking of there. But the key point is that this is a judicial review applying public law administrative concepts.
Therefore, it's oversight of the government.
And what if you've only got certain things that you've got to be considering, and the case is overwhelming on those things that you're supposed to be considering, it becomes legally irrational, which is not the same as sort of psychologically irrational or philosophically so. Legally irrational not to order. So if you've got a compelling case to order it, then you should order it.
Then you'd have a case for misconduct in public office against them, because they wouldn't be conducting their office in the required manner.
Well, that's a different type of procedure.
Yeah, of course. But if they chose to be legally irrational,
Well, we don't. Yes, but we don't need to go to prosecuting people for misconduct in public office. What we're trying to do is get the inquiry.
yeah,
Prosecuting them for misconduct in public office visits a punishment on that individual
yeah.
if convicted, but it doesn't get us an inquiry. So if we want an inquiry, we've got to do the judicial review, and that's what we're trying to do. And obviously, we need to raise money in order to do so.
So where can people donate to help you raise money, and how much you raised so far towards this?
I'm not sure how much we've raised so far, but we've raised enough to start the process, which is what we've been doing. We've written to the minister. We've got their official refusal to change their refusal, and therefore we're issuing the proceedings. But where the appeal is, it's on our English Democrats website. It's under a heading gang rapes.
And people can donate.
Rape gangs.
And people can donate over there.
Yes.
And how much do you need to raise roughly?
Well, the first stage of a judicial review probably costs about 8,000.
Oh, that's quite cheap.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that I'm rich, but I know how much legal things are.
Yeah. It's not a colossal cost at the first stage.
So one person could just fund that entirely, more or less, or yeah, that's
Possibly.
amazing.
Yeah. So if we get at the first stage, a judge agrees with what I've just argued with you, then there will be a hearing listed, and the judge doesn't have to agree that we're going to win the argument. He only has to agree that we've got an argument. At which point there's then a hearing listed, and we're then game on really for quite probably getting an order that the Labour government have to have a statutory inquiry.
Could this not be abused at some point later down the road by other people to force inquiries? Or do you believe that that's a good thing? Or could they not simply say, okay, we'll host an inquiry, but we're going to underfund it? Or we'll put in our appointee to oversee it?
So if let's say that the Labour minister misbehaves in terms of running the inquiry, each misbehaviour could be subject to a further judicial review.
I see.
To order them to do whatever they ought to have done in the first place.
So you constantly chase them?
And I mean that's basically what judicial review really should be about, and actually is and has been for years.
Okay. And you wouldn't have a jury in this, I take it, because they've removed juries from it?
There's never been juries in judicial review.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think it's a strong argument, and I think we need to remember Bertolt Brecht's famous comment, don't we? Which is that the man who fights may lose, but he who does not fight has already lost.
That is quite true.
So we need to fight this.
Well, in terms of your legal battles, before we end, could you quickly go through what you've been doing with the Workers of England Union and how that supports people?
Yes. So some years ago, we could see that people who were getting into problems with their employer were not getting a good service from the labour supporting trade unions. It's worth bearing in mind what the labour supporting trade unions think they're doing, which is basically focusing on raising money for labour. And they currently give them something like £25 million a year. And the way they achieve that is by not spending very much on their members. So typically what you get is the representative in your workplace is not paid, and they are a colleague. So if you fall out with your employer over anything, they're conflicted really, because if they advocate for you too forcefully, there's a good chance that they'll be the next one that the employer's thinking about getting rid of. And And so what we needed was a system, I thought, where you wound up with a rep that comes in from outside. And and the other problem is, of course, that the rep who works with you probably doesn't do much repping, so they don't know very much about the system, and therefore probably don't advocate for you
very well
out of ignorance. They don't do a very good job. But then there's also the point that the labour supporting trade unions are quite political. So just to give you an example of the kind of behaviour you get, where they refuse to represent people who are not on side politically. We had a nurse who came to us who'd been a member of Unison for 15 years or so. And we'd been hearing stories that the labour supporting unions were refusing to support. And this was about masks. And this lady had got asthma, and she couldn't wear a mask. She was being told she had to wear a mask. She wanted her union to help her to grievance that. And unusually, they wrote to her to say, Unison wrote to her, to say that they wouldn't represent her because it was against Labour Party policy. So, you see, we need to have a union that is actually going to do a proper professional job for its members. And that also means, of course, that where you're raising things that are reasonable for you to raise as an individual, but are not approved of by Labour in particular, but the powers that be in general, we need to have a proper union that actually does represent you in your grievance or your disciplinary with your employer. And so that's why we thought we needed a new union, the Workers' of England Union, and that's what we've been doing. We represented lots of nurses and care workers and so on who...
hundreds, thousands?
Yeah, thousands.
Thousands of people.
Thousands.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And how you saved thousands of people, or hundreds of people at least, from losing their jobs?
Yes. Yeah, we have. And in the cases where we haven't saved them from losing their jobs, we've often represented them in tribunals, where we've got to a point where the judgments of the tribunals are where the employers were saying that they had to sack the person because the law said that they had to sack them. Those are cases which the employers lose because it didn't say anything of the sort. And so what you've got was this sort of group think going on where people have just sort of panicked into saying that any disobedience to the guidance was a breach of the law, which of course guidance and law are not the same thing at all. So the employer loses those cases. In some instances, the employer was more determined to win and more thinking about organisational structure and systems. And so what some of them did was they created a rule within the employer's handbook, which said that you had to be vaccinated, for example. And where they did that, employers have been allowed to win by the employment tribunals because they've been enforcing their own policy.
But doesn't their policy violate the Equalities Act?
Well, obviously the arguments we've been using do strongly relate to the Equalities Act.
And fundamental common law principles that there was a contract signed for a job, and your employer cannot turn around and tell you to cut your hand off because it's in their rule book.
But it doesn't say that you can cut your hand off. Possibly in that case, the employment tribunals might have said that they couldn't do that.
But
I'm just telling you what the outcome's been. The employment tribunals have said that where there's a policy, the policy can be enforced. But of course, the point that you were making about the contract of employment, the contract of employment has to say you have to obey what it says in the handbook, which they normally do, by the way. Most contracts of employment do say that you have to obey the policies of the employer set out in the handbook, and not doing so will be misconduct.
If you add a new policy in and it's self-harm, then surely that would be invalid. It would simply be considered unreasonable practice.
Unfortunately, Will, law and common sense are only a very small overlap, if any. So, as a matter of common sense, I'm inclined to agree with you, but law doesn't quite work that way. And one of the points I was making earlier is that law is really what kind of decision comes out of the system, the court system or the tribunal system. And if people accept that, then that is the law.
I think we differ a little bit here.
Well, it just is the way that the system is operating.
I believe law is to be discovered, not dictated.
And you're believing in natural justice, and I believe in natural justice. It's just I'm describing the way the system actually works, and you and I might agree that it's an outrage for the head of the main courts in England to describe themselves as the Royal Courts of Justice, because they don't focus on providing justice. They focus on applying legal rules and also being very bureaucratic about the way in which the system is administered, and in particular using the bureaucracy of law to try and close down as many cases as possible.
Well, I'm afraid that we do have to wrap up about here, but before we go, could you give people details of where to find you, whether that's for the Workers of England Union, English Democrats, or you personally?
Yes. So we've got Workers of England Union.co.uk. We've got I've got a Twitter account at Robin Tilbrook. There's also a Twitter account for the English Democrats, which is at English Democrat, and the website for the English Democrats, at which the appeal for bringing the judicial review is rape gangs, which is on the headline sort of bar at the top of options with drop-down menu, and that is on our website, which is englishdemocrats.party.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you on.
Thank you.
For more exclusive behind-the-scenes content, please be sure to subscribe to our Patreon. It really helps us cover the cost of any live streams, events, protests, or anything that we do. You'll also be seeing any behind-the-scenes footage and anything that we might be doing with Defiance Records.
Resistance GB's new series, 1,000 Words, has me, portrait artist Jake Fern, talking to some of the key figures in the movement. Half my brain concentrating on having a conversation, and the other half on making a painting. Do I succeed at either? You be the judge.